All right. Welcome to our panel this morning, Schoolhouse Shock, Reasserting a Parent's Role in a Child's Education. My name is Michael Barba, and we are excited to be joined by two amazing panelists, DeAngelis and Kurtis Indorf. I'll go ahead and introduce them in just a moment, but I want to offer just one quick remark. In the last 18 months, we've seen a huge shift in public education nationwide. A lot of families in America, their dining rooms were turned into classrooms. We saw families get involved in their children's education in a way that they haven't in the past, myself included. It was interesting to have my two little ones at home and see what role as parents we really could and should be playing, and that we should have been playing all along. So it's really changed and reframed parents' participation in education. If we look, though, at the student outcomes, some basic ones, so reading and math outcomes in the state of Texas, we saw slow progress over the last decade. And then over the last 12 months, we've seen a real drop-off in them, such that 60% of kids are behind now in reading, 65% are behind in math. We know that after several years, 95% of the kids that are behind don't catch up. So we need to do better to do right by our kids. We need to be doing something different. And we're excited to be joined by Corey and Kurtis today to talk about what exactly that looks like and how we can empower families in the solutions that we're looking for. So first, I'll introduce Corey DeAngelis. Corey is the National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children. He is the Executive Director at Educational Freedom Institute, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and a Senior Fellow at Reason Foundation. He's authored over 40 journal articles, book chapters, and reports on education policy, and published research in Social Science Quarterly, School Effectiveness and School Improvements, Educational Review, and Peabody Journal of Education. He is a regular guest on Fox News, published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the New York Post, and the National Review. And he is a Forbes 30 under 30 for education policy and a recipient of the Buckley Award from America's Future in 2020. Corey, thank you for joining us. Not yet.
I didn't know how to, there it is. Oh, I just wanted to add, for the record, you can't really call me 30 under 30 anymore because I had a birthday and now I'm 30 years old. But yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction.
Of course, and we're also pleased to be joined by Kurtis Indorf. Kurtis is the founder and president of Great Hearts Nova, a new Great Hearts entity operating two revolutionary learning models for students and families in the state of Texas, Great Hearts Online and Great Hearts Micro Schools. He is the vice chair of the board of directors for Compass Rose Education, a charter school here in Texas, and he served in various leadership roles at KIPP public charter schools, including chief academic officer, chief people officer, and deputy chief of academics. He served as a gubernatorial appointee to the Colorado Charter School Institute's board of directors, an independent state agency for charter authorization. He has taught English language learners in Phoenix, Arizona, through Teach for America. So please welcome Kurtis Indorf.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
So thank you all very much for joining us today. I'd like to start off, Kurtis, with a brief introduction to Great Hearts and the work that you all are doing here. Great Hearts is a charter school in the state of Texas. They enroll about 7,000 students in the state. You all are growing by 25% every year, which is remarkable. You'll have a classical instructional model. Can you tell us a little bit more about the classical model and then what parents find so attractive about it?
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. Glad to be here. So many of you probably have read articles over the past year and a half about how classical education is really having a revival across the United States. So I want to just provide some insights into what is classical education. There's a broad spectrum, but there's some really important things that are true. The first thing that's true is that our purpose, what we're pointed toward, is different. The Great Hearts mission is to cultivate the hearts and minds of students in pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty, intellectual excellence, moral excellence, aesthetic excellence. And we talk about virtues and who you are in our school and educate and form towards that. So Great Hearts is not just about student achievement, although it is a necessary yet insufficient end. Great Hearts is about student formation. Who you are matters. So that's one thing that is deeply, deeply integrated into classical education. Secondly, Western civilization is shaped by the conversations of the great thinkers of the past 3,000 years, from Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. These are the conversations, these are the ideas that have shaped American democracy. Whether people agree with it or disagree with it, these are the ideas at play. And a classical education invites students into the great conversation to learn from primary sources, to learn philosophy, to think about the thoughts that have created America, and to grapple with them. That's the second really important piece of a classical education. Third, students are not purely intellectual beings. Music, art, foreign language, physical education, right? These things matter. And during a period of time when specials have been cut as unnecessary, classical education says, no, this is not unnecessary. This is vital to the formation of a whole person. And so that full piece is really important. Thank you. And then finally, a classical education employs a pedagogy of Socratic seminar, of discussion, of discourse, of asking good questions, of listening to your peers as they share their perspectives, cite opinions, listening and filtering for that information, and responding in dialogue. That pedagogical approach is really important, again, not just to student learning, but to the formation of self and the formation of society, the social fabric that undergirds what we do every day. So those are, there's a lot more to talk about classical education, but those are 4 things for people who are new to kind of understand what a classical education is. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kurtis. So classical education would be one option that is available to families through school choice. And Corey, in this last year, 2021, it was a banner year for school choice, right? We had...
Let's go!
We had 7 new programs established, the most in the movement's history. We had a lot of, a groundswell of support. Can you talk a little bit about the victories that we had and what led to those victories? What has changed?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for the comments, Kurtis. I think those comments were super important for this year in particular because a lot of parents figured out that their schools are failing their kids in a new way, which is that the school isn't teaching their children in a way that aligns with their values. So this is an important conversation to have, that the teachers' unions overplaying their hand have really awakened a sleeping giant, which happens to be parents who want more of a say in their kids' education. And look, it's a great time to be a school choice advocate right now, but one of the biggest advocates over the past couple of years now has been Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, for doing my job for me. Thank you so much. I should give her an award one of these days. I live pretty close to their offices in DC, which is another story. But look, 19 states in 2021 expanded or enacted programs to fund students as opposed to systems. And families all across the country are finally figuring out that there isn't any good reason to fund failing, closed government institutions when you can fund the student directly instead. The latest Real Clear Opinion research polling, for example, found a 10 percentage point surge in support for school choice, or what I would call funding students directly, from 64% support in April of 2020 to 74% support in June of 2021. And the biggest jumps in support were among parents who had kids in the public school system. Well, the public school system wasn't really serving them all that well in 2020. And among Democrats as well, there was an 11 percentage point surge among Democrats to now 70% of Democrats supporting the concept of the money following the child to wherever they get an education. And in Texas, the latest Morning Consult polling has found that about 77% of parents support school choice. So there's a huge uptick in momentum around the idea that the money should follow the child. And the way that I put it before is that COVID didn't break the government school system, it was already broken. And the past 2 years now has simply shined a spotlight on the main problem with K-12 education all across the country, which happens to be a massive, long-existing power imbalance between the government school monopoly and individual families. For a long time in K-12 education, the only special interest was essentially the teachers union and the superintendent's unions for the employees. But now there's a new special interest group in town, which happens to be parents. And they're not going away anytime soon. They've woken up. They saw what happened in 2020. Parents all across the country felt powerless when it came to education in 2020. And they're going to fight going forward to make sure they never feel powerless like that ever again. And I'm optimistic going forward because, look, parents care about their kids more than anybody else. And they're going to fight for the right to educate their children as they see fit, harder than anyone will ever fight to take that right away from them. So politicians will be wise to listen to this new special interest group, parents, going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. And Kurtis, you all heard the need that parents in Texas were voicing over the last 12 months, over the last 18 months, and you responded by opening Great Hearts Nova and Great Hearts Micro Schools. Can you talk a little bit about that process? What did you hear from families specifically that they wanted? And then how did you all go about meeting that need?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Corey. It's a very, very dynamic and disruptive time in education, and there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of dynamics at play. I don't think many people are actually paying attention to those movements, to those dynamics, and so I'm really grateful that everyone's here today. Last fall, Great Hearts has always had strong partnerships with homeschool communities, and we're thinking about how do we partner with parents in deeper ways. And so last fall, Commissioner Morath provided some flexibilities, that's the TEA commissioner in Texas, to provide an online school statewide. And so we raised about $700,000, built a team designed from the ground up. We have 15 kids in a live classroom. Most online schools are lonely, uninspiring, and procedural. I will be the first to say that. But they don't have to be. The highest performing school in Idaho is an online school. We just got back winter map data this week that said that Great Hearts Online students are performing at 27% higher than the national average in reading and 22% higher than the national average in math. Thank you. It's a testament to our teachers. And it's also a testament to the partnership that we form with parents, because we found that families want to be more intimately involved in their kids' formation and education. But to say, be more involved and also plan 7 subjects a day for your 3 kids multiplied by 3 is very overwhelming for many families. And so we think about how can we partner with families? How can we work with parents? How can we provide families a more integrated family unit, where education does not happen in a box over here, but is part of the life of a family? And so last January, we launched Great Hearts Online with 500 students across the state of Texas. We are 1 year and 16 days into running the school, and we have over 1,000 kids, and we're operating in 2 states right now. And students are learning and thriving, and parents are happy. It is not for all, but for parents that want to make the choice to be more deeply involved and have the resources and opportunity to do so, and want to integrate education and life together as one with a safe, classical educational model that is world-class. It's a great option for them. And then we talked to parents last winter, and we said, what are you liking? What are you looking for more? And parents said, this is lovely, this is amazing. We also want to figure out how do we get together in a pod or in a micro school type structure. Maybe it's 3 days a week, maybe it's 5 days a week. What does that look like? Over the past 2 years, a Titan study showed us that micro schools, which are small schools, not in traditional buildings, right? 2 to 60 kids, have exploded in growth. Micro schools serve over 1.5 million students this past year. It took the charter sector 17 years to serve 1.5 million students. Parents spent more money in 2020 on micro schools and pods than in traditional private brick and mortar schools. This is a massive shift. This is an enormous shift that is happening right now. And so we thought, how do we partner with parents? How do we partner with community organizations, with churches, with businesses, to provide a in-person Great Hearts education powered by Great Hearts Online anywhere across Texas, anywhere across Arizona, in a really flexible way. And I'm excited to share that we're launching our first micro school in Phoenix this month and our first micro school in Dallas-Fort Worth in February.
Kurtis, as a follow-up to that, as a school system leader, what does the regulatory structure look like in Texas as you work to start up an online school for students, that wouldn't have access to it otherwise? What do you see, and what does that interaction with the state look like?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. This is really important, I think, probably for us all to know. SB 15 was a bill that we're currently operating to provide an online education across the state. Last session, regular session, it had bipartisan support, and it was not voted on because of the walkout on May 30th. So we launched Great Hearts Online in Texas as a private school because there was no public path to do so, and enrolled 125 kids in 3 weeks, and then I shut down enrollment. Just to be really transparent, that's a lot of kids in a private school in a very short period of time. So it starts to illustrate the demand and the interest for something different. In the second special session, SB 15 was passed, and so we were happy to relaunch Great Hearts Online Texas as a public charter school on November 1st. Another big factor and mix here is the talent environment. It is difficult to hire teachers right now in brick and mortar schools, very difficult. I had 1,400 applications for 40 teaching jobs for November 1st mid-year opening for Great Hearts Online. And so SB 15 exists for 1 year and 6 months longer. In 1 year and 6 months, Great Hearts Online does not have the legislative path to continue to operate as a public school of choice. So this next regular session is going to be really important to come up with policy that allows education, innovation, choice to continue to move forward in the state of Texas.
Awesome, thank you, Kurtis. And Corey, the sort of pent-up demand that we're seeing here in Texas with Great Hearts exists elsewhere in the nation. Can you shed some light on what you see when a school choice program is established in another state, how families respond to that? What do you hear from those families?
Yeah, it's a popular program, and that's why the establishment is so afraid. That's why they scream bloody murder whenever there's any notion that choice may be introduced into a state, because they know parents want it. Just think about it. Their main argument is that, oh, choice sounds fine and all, but that's going to steal money from the public schools. No, the money doesn't belong to the government schools in the first place. Education funding is meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution. And they're essentially admitting that they understand that families aren't happy with what they're getting in the current system. And so that's really an argument for choice, not against it. If you think that so many people are going to leave your institutions, what does that say about the confidence you have in your own institutions? No one would ever say that allowing families to choose their grocery store stole money from HEB, because the money doesn't belong to HEB in the first place, even if you're using food stamps, for example, or taxpayer funds. No one would say that Pell Grant programs steal money from community colleges just because you can use them at private religious universities. But look, in New Hampshire, for example, they just passed education freedom accounts, which is one of the most expansive education savings account programs in the nation. And 1% of their school-aged population has already been approved to use that program in the first year. 1% is not a ton, but it is a large amount of demand, relatively speaking. If you look at Governor Doug Ducey in Arizona, he just announced a program a couple of months ago and another one this past month. If you disagreed with your COVID policies in your government-run school, you could take a $7,000 voucher to a private school or a micro school type of setting. And the amount of demand for that program, for example, doubled the supply of funding in the first 2 weeks. So parents want these options, and that's why the establishment is terrified whenever any type of bill is introduced, whether it's a universal bill that everybody could use, or even when it's a little tiny bill, because they know that once families get an option, they're going to fight as hard as possible to keep educational freedom. We saw what happened in Florida, for example. Governor DeSantis can thank school choice moms for his victory in the gubernatorial race in 2018. You establish a new constituency that uses these programs, and if your opponent wants to take away these scholarships from these families, well, those families are going to fight really hard to get you back into office. So there's tons of demand for it all across the country, and Kurtis had mentioned some shifts that we've seen over the past year, so I wanted to introduce a couple more shifts that we've seen as well. We've seen a mass exodus from the government-run school system. About 1.5 million students have left government-run schools all across the nation. That's about 3.3% of the school-age public school population. Public charter schools have seen an increase in demand, a 7.1% increase in enrollment, according to the latest numbers from the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools, which they shared data from 42 different states, and that's the latest data that we have. And then homeschooling has blossomed as well. Relative to pre-pandemic levels, the U.S. Census Bureau's American Pulse survey indicates that homeschooling has at least doubled relative to pre-pandemic levels. Formal homeschooling, not government schooling at home, but actually not having your kid enrolled in a public or private school option. So those are some huge shifts. Anybody else hear about the National School Board Association? Yeah, everybody laughs because we can't even really call it the National School Board Association anymore. We might as well call it the Regional School Board Association, because 19 states have already announced that they're going to cut ties with the National School Board Association because they sent a letter to the Biden administration essentially implying that some parents should be labeled as what? Domestic terrorists. It turns out that's not a really good strategy, is it? They've essentially destroyed their own empire by letting the mask slip. They've been drunk on power for decades, for so long, that it seems like they can't reverse course. And finally, parents are pushing back, and this is just one example of that. And I have to point out, because we are in Texas, that Texas is not one of those 19 states that is pulled out of the National School Board Association. But there is the opportunity for districts to pull out of the state-level Texas Association of School Boards if they so choose to hold them accountable. There's 1,024 districts that pay membership dues to the Texas Association of School Boards, which is an organization that has not pulled out of the National School Board Association as of today. So there's a lot of shifts, some states more than others, but I'm confident going forward because politicians are starting to understand that it is possible political suicide to come out against parental rights.
And Kurtis, we at TPPF are working on a parent empowerment campaign for exactly the reasons that Corey mentioned. We want to make sure that families have transparency, that they have quality in their schools, that they are met with respect when they voice concerns, and that they ultimately have a choice over their child's education. How does Great Hearts, when families come to you, how do you provide them transparency? How do you assure them of the quality of the schools? How do you communicate with them in a respectful way?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the data, Corey. So we strive to be in partnership with parents, right? You all, and me as a parent, we are responsible for the education of our kids. And we partner with a school or an organization to educate our kids. So we strive to be in partnership with parents and families. A big part of that is communication. It's also education. So, we have certain curriculum that we use as we educate our kids in our classrooms. And so we have curriculum nights where we share all that information openly with parents and families and train them on, here's Spalding, here's Singapore, here's our history curriculum, like here's what we do. This open information about what we're doing so that we can be in better and closer partnership with families. That work is really even accelerated in Great Hearts Online because a teacher has a partner of a parent at home who's also working with their kids every single day. And so one of the wonderful things is, we listen really closely to parents, and they've reached out and said, I've had more contact this week with my child's teacher than I had in a brick and mortar setting for 6 months. And so it's just a fundamental shift in how we work together. And we believe that that is good for kids, it's good for teachers, it's good for parents, it's good for families. And so really eager to continue that journey of what does it mean to be in partnership with each other, pointed towards a common goal. There's lots of things that are not yet working that we're working on because Great Hearts Online, Great Hearts Micro Schools are startups, right? Very much a startup. But we're striving towards that common purpose. And so the communication lines are open, information is shared regularly. We have town halls where parents can ask questions. We have information sessions where we share openly what's going on. This summer is a great example. When Texas policy did not come through for 1,600 kids in Texas to get their school of choice in Great Hearts Online, Texas, weekly I communicated with them and had open town halls telling them what was happening, what we're moving forward and what we're doing. Sent out a survey saying, would you want us to build a private school because it's the only path forward that we can actually build and make financially viable? And they said yes, and so we did it. And so it's really parents leading the way, and we're listening and partnering with them as best we can.
And then as a question for both of y'all, we do have over 1,000 school districts in the state of Texas. About half of them are in rural areas, have enrollment below 500 kids. In terms of providing greater access to great education to those kids, what sort of policies can we pursue as a state to make sure that the kids in the most rural community in Texas are put on the same footing as kids in Dallas? How can we make sure that they get a great education?
Yeah, so the best solution here is something called an education savings account. Has everybody heard of an education savings account? If you haven't, I'll explain it really quickly. It's a similar concept as a voucher, where the money that would have followed your child to the government-run school, you could take it in the form of a voucher to a private school, a brick-and-mortar school, but it doesn't have to be used at a private brick-and-mortar school, for example. With an education savings account, that same funding that would have followed your child to the government-run option follows your child into something called an education savings account, much like a health savings account. And then you could still just use that money to pay for private school tuition and fees if you'd like. But if not, you could also use it for online learning. You could use it for a micro school, so you don't have to build another school. You could do it in a household, like with these pandemic pods that we saw in 2020, which makes the supply side response a lot more robust in rural areas where if you don't have a ton of brick and mortar private schools, this is the best option going forward, so you can use it on anything that is defined as education, which is important, and it really takes us from school choice to education choice, which is a great thing because schooling is just one way to achieve an education. So this opens up a lot more opportunities for students, especially in rural areas, and I will say that, look, everybody in the room knows that we've heard that the reason that Texas hasn't gotten private school choice yet is that there are rural areas and there are, legislators in those areas that aren't voting for it. But look, West Virginia just passed the most expansive education savings account program in the nation in 2021. They didn't have any charter schools in 2020. They didn't have any private school choice initiatives allowing the funding to follow the child in 2020. And now they have the most expansive ESA program in the nation. They have rural legislators that voted for it. And so I don't think it's a good excuse to not support allowing all families' education dollars to follow them to wherever they're getting an education. But I do think the reason that we've heard that is because rural legislators hear two things at the same time that are fundamentally incompatible with one another. They can't both be true. Has anybody seen the two-button meme on social media where the guy's trying to think, like, which one should I press? It's to point out a logical inconsistency that you can't hold two things, two views at the same time. They'll hear that your constituents can't use this because you don't have private schools. And then at the same time, they'll hear, well, this is the largest employer here, the public schools, and it's gonna destroy your public schools. Well, one, that's an admission that you don't think families are happy in those schools. But then two, if nobody's using the program, you won't lose any money. So it can't be both of those those things at the same time. And I think if we can isolate what the real concern is between those two things, I think we can move the ball forward in Texas. And I think it is becoming political suicide to oppose parental rights in education. Look at what happened in Virginia. Terry McAuliffe will go down in history for having the biggest campaign blunder of all time. On the debate stage, the final debate, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. And then instead of backpedaling from that, he quadrupled down in multiple media appearances day after day leading up to the election. And who did he have at his final campaign rally the night before the election? The person I gave an award to earlier, Randy Weingarten. That should have been counted as an in-kind contribution to the Youngkin campaign. But look, like I said earlier, I think school choice, we've won the logical battle with school choice. There's no good argument to fund the buildings when you can fund the student directly instead, especially when the same people who oppose school choice support funding individuals as opposed to institutions with everything else. We already fund students directly with higher education with Pell Grants and the GI Bill. We already fund students directly with pre-K programs that you can take to private providers. We already fund people as opposed to institutions when it comes to Medicaid. We already do it with food stamps. You can choose your grocery store. You don't have to go to a residentially assigned government-run provider of groceries. And the same people that support all those other things only get upset about it when it comes to K-12 education. And why would that be? There's only one way to bridge that apparent logical inconsistency is to understand that there's a difference in power dynamics. Choice is the norm for now in higher education and pre-K and every other industry in the United States, thankfully. But choice threatens an entrenched special interest only when it comes to the in-between years of K-12 education. So they fight as hard as possible against any change to the status quo. But look, the jig is up and they've overplayed their hand. And at this point, the entrenched special interest is actively destroying its own empire, and it's glorious.
Well said. I just want to echo Corey's thought here. We're talking about school choice, but there's a really important schema shift from school choice to parent choice, or from school choice to education choice. Those two things are not the same. Right? One implies that a school must be the end point, and you have to have others of them. The other says, no, parents are the decision makers for their children. That's a pretty big schema shift. I think part of this is making that schema shift more apparent in the conversation. In terms of serving families across more rural areas, the world is we live in a very global world right now. A student searching the internet for something in one city is going to get the same thing if they're in a rural area. But why in education can we not think about using tools in different ways? One really interesting thing about education technology is that $16.1 billion was invested into ed tech in 2021. That doubled from 2022, and that was doubled from 2019. Now, not all of these things am I saying is good. Technology for technology's sake is not good, or I don't believe is the right way of doing it. We actually design intentionally a hybrid educational model where kids are on a computer learning for part of the time, but then they shut their computer and we ship them materials and supplies and science kits so that they can do, with beakers and dissection labs in their kitchen. Because closing a computer and holding onto real things, concrete things, matters. But when we think about education in rural areas, how can we leverage the tools that impact a global commerce and global business society to serve those kids, to serve those families? How can we think about partnerships with districts or partnerships with churches or community organizations or businesses? You're a knowledge industry in a rural area, and you have a talent shortage. Parents want to make sure that their kids are going to an excellent school. And that employee looks around and may not see the excellent school they want their kids to go to. Now, that is a threat not only to that town, but to that employer. Great Hearts Micro Schools could partner with that employer and actually have a Great Hearts Micro Schools in one or two of their buildings as an employee benefit. So there's really different ways of thinking about this that maximize the best of both and give parents, employees, towns, cities talented people choices in the future about what education can and should look like.
Thank you. And I'm wondering next, with regard to student outcomes, what effect does parent empowerment have on improving student outcomes from other states in the nation? And Kurtis, you pointed at some of the most recent student outcomes. What do you see as a long-term trend from your all's work in Arizona and then your brick and mortars here in Texas as well? How has your work moved the needle in improving student performance?
So there's a lot of outcomes to look at, right? But most of the research looks at standardized test scores, something that parents might not care all that much about. But we do have a ton of evidence, at least on what happens to the kids who remain in the public schools. As I said earlier, the main argument is, right, you're gonna destroy our public schools. But everywhere that we've looked, the public schools have actually gotten better. Why? Because of competition. They start to have to think a little bit about how they allocate their resources, and some other studies have found that more resources actually start to go into the classroom as opposed to administrative bloat and staffing surges, which are great for teachers' unions, but not so great for teachers or students. Which is another strand of research, which 5 studies that I've seen have found that public charter school and private school competition has led to higher teacher salaries in the public school system. So when you hear that school choice, if you're for school choice, you must be anti-teacher. My first response is, well, there are teachers in the charter and private school sector. What about them? And then 2, the 5 studies we have on the topic find that, well, actually the public school teacher salaries rise in response to competition because their employer is currently a monopoly that has no particularly strong incentive to allocate resources into the classroom. Instead, and we've seen this all across the nation, even with COVID money, in Los Angeles, they've lost 6% of their school-age population in their district, losing tons of customers. Yet they're planning to increase the number of teachers in the building by 8%, the number of custodial workers by 25%, and the number of social workers by about 80%. In what other industry do you lose 6% of your customer base and you increase staffing by 8%? It's just totally backwards. But the reason that they do that is because it leads to more dues-paying members in their union, which is great for Randy Weingarten, who's making over $560,000 a year, but it's not so great for the teachers. And another study by Ben Scafferty from Kennesaw State University found that between 1992 and 2014, nationwide, per pupil education expenditures after adjusting for inflation increased by 27%. Teacher salaries in real terms, anybody want to guess how much the teacher salaries raised between that time? Less. 20? It's less than 27, pretty close. It's actually a negative number. It's a 2% drop in teacher salaries. So we're throwing more and more money at the problem. The teachers aren't seeing it. So when teachers complain about having to pay out of pocket for supplies, I actually do feel kind of bad for them. But their problem isn't with their competition. Their problem is with their employer, which happens to be a monopoly. And what was the question again? I was going somewhere with that. I know I was.
So student outcomes and how that affects.
So 25 of 27 studies on the topic, and give a nod to EdChoice. They have a very nice guidebook called the 1, 2, 3s of school choice. They summarize all 27 studies on the topic. 25 of the 27 studies find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the kids who remain in the public schools. So there's no evidence that whenever school choice is introduced, the public schools get worse. In fact, they actually get a little better. Partially because of competition, but then also because, think about it mathematically, the public schools actually financially benefit on a per pupil basis when it comes to school choice. Typically, the amount of funding that follows the child is about half of what would have been spent in the government schools. What does that mean with the rest of the funding? The local funding stays in the local schools. So on a per pupil basis, their per pupil revenues raise. They have to. If you don't lose 100% of the funding for the student and you lose the full student, on a per pupil basis, you end up with more money per child. So if you want to raise per pupil revenues and expenditures, here's one way to do it: school choice. And it's a win-win scenario for the kids in the public schools and obviously the kids who attend the private schools. The best evidence of the kids getting a better education when they have school choice is, did they choose the school and did they like it? Did they stay there? We don't really need evidence to show us that school choice is good for families. If you believe that families have the best interest of their child and have the best information about what their children need. And if you look at the evidence on non-test score outcomes, including crime reduction, I've done 2 of these studies. There are 6 peer-reviewed studies linking school choice through charters or private schools to crime reduction. All 6 studies are peer-reviewed, and all of them find statistically significant negative effects on crime, but positive effects on crime reduction. For example, in Harlem Children's Zone in New York City, Dobby and Fryer, Harvard and Princeton researchers found that if you won a lottery to go to a charter school in Harlem Children's Zone in New York City, that completely eliminated the likelihood of incarceration for male students, 100% reduction. The lottery losers, it was about a 4% incidence rate of incarceration for students, 0% in the lottery winner group. And that's a gold standard experiment. You can't say it's because the people who randomly got into the charter school had more advantaged parents, or you can't say it's because they were more advantaged to begin with, because just like we understand that medical trials work and medicines and vaccines work, they use random assignment to see who gets the drug, and they use a random lottery to determine who gets the sugar pill, the placebo. So you can be reasonably confident that winning a lottery to go to a charter school in New York City eliminated crime for male students. And for female students, they found a 59% reduction in the likelihood of teenage pregnancy, which is important as well. And a study that I did in Milwaukee found a statistically significant reduction in crime for male students, and then also a decrease in I think it was like a 38% reduction in the likelihood of having a paternity suit by the time you're about 30 years of age, which is also another important life outcome. So when you start to look at these longer term outcomes, like enrolling in college, not being involved with the criminal justice system, the evidence is much more clear when it comes to school choice. And I think it's because parents care about a lot of things. And this is part of the awakening and momentum for school choice that started in 2020, because while the government school's version of remote learning, which we couldn't even really call remote learning, maybe remotely learning because they didn't do a good job of it, or maybe just remote instruction, or if we want to be real, in a lot of places it was just a school closure if the kids didn't have much face-to-face instruction or even remote instruction when they logged in. Families got to see what was going on in the classroom. And I think that's why we're seeing such a big push for school choice. Before, maybe a lot of families thought their kids were in good public schools based on average math and reading test scores, but that doesn't capture what parents actually care about. Schools are about forming the child for their life. It's another way of raising the child. And alarm bells started to go off with so many parents across the country when they started to figure out that they're sending their kid to a school where they feel like they're being indoctrinated for 13 years. That doesn't sit well with parents, and that's why they're not going to sit down and shut up going forward, no matter how many times members of the establishment try to label them as domestic terrorists. Parents have woken up, and they're never going to unsee what they saw in 2020.
Awesome. Thank you, Corey.
I don't think there's anything else for me to say there.
Well, maybe I'll reframe it a little bit. So in terms of the goals that, for example, I don't know, TEA cares about at a state level, right? They look at literacy and numeracy and measure that on the STAR test. Great Hearts is unique in that you offer a more comprehensive view of what education can be and should be. What goals matter most to parents and families about their children's education? When you talk to them, what do they want? What do they hope that their children will achieve in their lives?
I think most parents want their kids to grow up to be good kids, good people. You want academic achievement, you want intellectual success, you want formation and appreciation of these things. But to become and grow into your best self matters deeply. I also think that parents are thinking a lot about how do I provide a wide and not shallow education for my child? So most students, when they go to college, they have not read Plato's Republic. They have not read Aristotle or Socrates. They have not read primary texts. They have not studied the Federalist Papers. They have not read and analyzed and had seminar about the Constitution. And yet we live in America where these things have shaped who we are and why decisions are made and the dynamics and the conversation of the past 3,000 years. Classical education has been the primary form by which the elite ruling class has been educated for thousands of years. This is not really a question. And now Great Hearts is about bringing that in public form to all families, to democratize a world-class education for all. And so that's something that parents are really excited about, right? The depth, the philosophy, the primary text, the thinking, and asking kids to grapple with that themselves and arrive at their own conclusions through discourse shaped by an expert facilitator. That is a different education. And just like Corey said, parents saw in COVID on computer screens, or maybe not, what their students were learning. And oftentimes it's shallow, it's not very deep, it's snippets of text. There's not a lot of critical thinking. And that's scary as a parent. That's disappointing as a parent. And all parents, we all want better for our kids. I want a better education for my children than I got myself. All of us want that to be true. And so that matters a lot to parents. Now, it's really important that in order for that high bar, that pure form to be reached, a lot of other indicators need to be met along the way. Students need to be learning. I am proud to say that last year, if we were evaluated, Great Hearts Online would have had a 92% in student growth and an A on the TEA accountability rating in just 6 months. I'm proud to say that based on Winter Map, which is a norm-referenced national assessment, we're 27% above the national norm in reading and 22% above the national norm in math, and we've been open since November 1st. So these things are possible, right? Those indicators must be true on the way to the higher bar. So you can't, it's not either or, right? But parents are looking for something deeper. They're looking for something more meaningful, and that's not going away anytime soon. This is other really fascinating data, over the past 2 years. If parents do not find what they are looking for in the educational ecosystem, they are building it themselves. And so we can either invite that into the public square to be funded and to have access to all, or it's gonna happen anyways. I don't think it's a question of whether it will. It is happening now. It's just not available to all because our policy hasn't yet caught up to that fact.
Awesome. Thank you both. We have time for a few questions from you all in the audience. Yes, please. And there's a microphone on its way.
Hello. So I think this is for Kurtis. So as a homeschooling mom for 30 years, it sounds to me as if your model has taken a great deal from that model. I mean, that's what most homeschoolers strive for, is you are hitting every point on there. And then sub-point, as a nutrition professional for the last 10 years, I hope nutrition is included in your whole person.
Well, I really appreciate that. And we work to form, I'd say the ideal family in many ways for Great Hearts Online is what I describe as homeschool light, right? They want to have a more integrated family experience. They want rigorous academics. They want all the depth and to be involved in it, which is very, very hard to do in a homeschool setting. It's a lot of work. I could not do that. And so we really form partnerships. And that's how we want to shape students and partner with families. So I appreciate that.
And another question from over here.
Yeah. My question is for Corey DeAngelis. Thank you for acknowledging the issue related to the rural areas and how the rural legislators perceive this issue. Because of that, you've spared me having to set up this question. So thank you. You mentioned West Virginia, obviously, as a very rural state that passed a very comprehensive law to do this, and between them and then any other states you may have had that have sort of similar demographics and did something similar, how did they ultimately crack that nut politically? Because, I can tell you straight up that, in 2017, the last time they tried, it was DOA in the Texas House, and they haven't even tried the last 2 sessions.
Yeah, thanks for the question. In 2017, I actually came to testify in Austin as well, and it passed through the Senate, which was great, with a pretty good majority. I actually did some research on that Senate vote, and I think about half of the no votes sent their own kids to private school, which is pretty interesting. Didn't find the rest of them, but yeah, that's another wrinkle to this. There's a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to school choice. The West Virginia story is actually pretty interesting. They tried in 2019, and Senator Rucker was one of the biggest champions of that bill in 2019, and didn't happen. They dwindled it down, didn't do anything to change the votes. So I think part of the shift between 2019 and now has been COVID, parents waking up, but then in West Virginia in particular, the teachers' unions came out hard against Senator Rucker to try to fire her, essentially. Didn't work. And so I think other legislators seeing that the unions, even though they sound scary, if they're not as scary as they really are, if they don't have as much power as they think they do, because, look, there's more parents than teachers unions members. So we have more power in numbers. And I think if you look at the polling, school choice is a popular issue. It's just a small group that screams really loudly against any change to the status quo to try to protect their monopoly. It's a concentrated interest problem. And I think if we can show people that it's not politically damaging to support families and children and to do the right thing that a majority of all political demographics support, then you can start to sway people that way. And I think that's part of the story in West Virginia. COVID's the other wrinkle. So I think it's both of those things. And look, in Texas, we had a couple of school choice champions win pretty recently. Brian Harrison, for example, he made his whole campaign all about school choice and won by 11 percentage points recently. So, and his opponent was a school choice. It wasn't a school choice advocate like he is. So I think having more of these examples of showing the reality that embracing educational freedom and parental rights is not something that you should be ashamed of, and that it's actually something that could be politically profitable. We saw that. We have examples with Ron DeSantis in Florida. We have examples with what happened in West Virginia. We have examples in Virginia with the Governor Youngkin. And Winsome Sears is a huge proponent of school choice as well. So more of those examples are always going to be helpful.
Thank you, Corey. We have a question in the back here.
Hi, my name is Dr. Gina Smith. I'm a psychologist, and just to say, I'm from a very rural area where I grew up. I grew up in a town of 500. I was a product of Title I schools, and my educators actually made a choice to let me leave to go to college when I was 16. They took the hit because they chose me over the money, and I think that's the only reason why I'm a doctor today. So I'm a huge proponent of school choice. I think it's incredibly, incredibly important. My question is, how are you guys addressing the issue that we're having with mental health? Because I treat first responders and veterans, but I started out in my career specializing in suicide. And so I've been in suicide for more than a decade. And I have noticed in my private practice that I've been seeing more and more children under the age of 12 that are suicidal or have committed suicide. I have come across numerous people. I'm running for a political office, and as I'm calling donors, I'm starting to have people saying, I'm having a problem. I'm noticing a problem. I'm hearing from people that they're having a problem. It's affecting everybody. Suicide is a very serious issue that we have with our young people. We really have avoided this for a long time because it's the no-no word. Makes us sad, I get that, but we've got to address this. Our highest age risk group is teenagers, and it's specifically teenage boys. So I would like to know, what are we gonna do? What's the plan to empower these kids with social and emotional regulation, tolerance, frustration tolerance, because that also affects their ability to read and write. I used to work in schools, And that was one of the reasons why I was there, was to teach them how to emotionally regulate, so then they could sit and figure out the math problem instead of throwing their pen down and breaking something and storming out of the room, right? So what are you guys doing on that, or what are your thoughts about that?
Sure, so just a little bit of framing, and then I'll turn it over to Kurtis to explain how they engage with families and support students. So when COVID hit in early 2020, the TEA made a decision similar to a couple other states, so like Florida, for example, to not just go to online learning for that next school year. The state policy said that for any family that wants in-person learning, individual school districts, charter schools had to make that in-person learning available. And what we saw at a state level was that that gave students a lot more contact with their community in a way that supported them, in a way that in other states that were fully online, they lacked that support. It was just completely taken away from them in a way that was very detrimental to their health. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kurtis to explain a little bit about how Great Hearts is engaging with their families on this issue.
Yeah, thank you for framing that and for the work that you do. It's a very important topic. I'm not an expert by any means. Connection and relationship are what we focus on. Relationships are the center of what we do, the relationships between the teacher and the student, between students with each other, and relationships with families and with parents. That's the core, and when those relationships are strong and you introduce rigorous high-quality content into it, the relationship between content and curriculum and students can be formed. But until the relationships between a student and teacher are strong, or a teacher and a parent are strong, that curriculum, that instruction, that content is outside of that circle. And so relationships are where we focus. We spend a lot of time building community. The one thing that Great Hearts, I think, has scaled and grown better than anything else is our culture. Culture is very, very hard to replicate and to have high quality. And that is actually what Great Hearts is best at. And so we've been working on how do you translate an authentic relationship-based culture into an online space. Our students are digital natives in a way that we are not. And so it's very different than how I live my life and how many of us live our lives. But what students have found is in class, we have classes of 15 kids. They go into breakout rooms of like 2 to 3. They form friendships right away. We talk to kids like, oh, I was talking to my friend. My best friend lives, 300 miles away in this other city. And then we get on a Zoom and we do homework together. And then our parents meet up and they drive to parks across the state. And we have in-person regional gatherings monthly as well, because in-person and online matters. Another really important piece here is that unless we teach students how to interact in an online forum in a healthy way, they will adopt whatever is out there. That's a big topic, and I certainly do not know how to approach that. But one thing that's really important is that online, there's a lot of anonymity, right? It's just a name, and people do say things that are really inappropriate or mean or hurtful. Part of what we're trying to teach in an online school is that that name in that discussion thread is a human being. And you're gonna get to know that human being, and they're gonna invite you into their home and play the piano and show them their dog, right? Like really relationally deep things to build connections and to teach students how to be healthy in an online space that they are digitally native to. So I don't have answers, but we're really focusing on the relationship and the community as one of the key pieces that we can develop.
And we have another question from the middle.
Yeah, my name's George Pond, and recently George Barna came out with an extensive study on millennials who have been basically the product of public schools. A couple of things he found. He found a large percentage of millennials have no sense of purpose in their life. Number two, they're having high percentages of mental health issues. And number three, they don't have a sense of sacredness in life. They don't see it that way. So his bottom line is millennials lack a biblical worldview. How are y'all going to address in these classical education issues, and I mean curriculums, how are you going to teach the Bible? Because we can't be a society without the Bible. This has been our heritage from the beginning of the founding of this country. That's my thought.
I can provide a little bit of framing. So there are, if we think back to the Constitution of the state of Texas, within the Constitution, it says that the purpose of public education is to preserve the liberties and rights of the people, right? And that comes directly from Thomas Jefferson's bill that he filed in Virginia to establish public education there. We have handed down to us a heritage in which education is more than just for more than just economic prosperity. Like at a basic level, it should put students on a path to prosperity, yes. But then we should also add and step back and say, but why should we have prosperity? Because we don't want our children just to live, we want them to live well. We want them to use the gifts that they are given, right, to take care of themselves and their neighbors. There is a way, I would offer to you, there is a way to do that within public education that is not a religious education. That's what I would offer to you, and Thomas Jefferson had that view as well. There is a way to educate children for a life of civic virtue and moral virtue without direct religious instruction. Corey?
And I'll just say that different families are going to have different ways to achieve that, right? So one way might be through religion. That's a good reason to fight for education savings accounts. One size doesn't fit all, and maybe you can find that in the public education system or through a classical education charter school, or maybe you want a pure religious type of school that's a private school. So I think that's just another argument for why we should allow families to sort, because I don't think one system is going to work for every single child. And I just want to get back to the mental health issues. I think this was also exacerbated by the school closures, the involuntary school closures. If you look at the Journal of American Medical Association, they recently came out with a 2021 study finding that places that had more school closures over the pandemic period had higher increases in mental health issues for children, all else equal, while controlling for tons of different background characteristics. Top medical journal. And the CDC reported, I believe in 2021 or 2022, there was a 31% uptick in teen suicide attempts, or at least the emergency department visits associated with those attempts. Even higher for female students, I believe it was about 51% increase. So it's just extremely horrendous that this happened. And my latest study at the Social Science Research Network also found upticks in parent mental health issues as well, having to deal with the uncertainty of the closures, and that's co-authored with Clara Piano and Christos Makrides, if you want to check it out. But it's not an easy issue to solve, but I would say, I just want to add that opening the schools is a very low bar for fixing these problems, right? You can't just say, okay, the schools are open now the mental health issues are going to go away, because we had it before, we had these problems before COVID and school closures. And a recent study that I've done on the topic with Western Carolina University's Angela Dills actually found that when states implemented charter school laws and allowed for more school choice, teenage suicide attempts or actual teenage suicides dropped in those states after controlling for a wide variety of policy changes and demographic characteristics that change over time within states. It's not a perfect solution, but it's not a huge leap in logic to realize that having a student in an environment that they're not getting bullied every day, and they're somewhere where they feel like they're actually achieving something, that could have spillover effects that could benefit their mental health as well. Maybe that's through a classical education and how you guys are doing it at Great Hearts. Maybe it's through another means. Maybe it's through a religious school. There's a lot of ways to achieve that, right? But forcing kids into a government-run institution for 13 years without exit options is not going to be helpful. And so at a very bare minimum, We need to allow to have choice for in-person, but we also have to have the choice of what type of school is best going to meet the needs of a child. And I think this is another reason why we have to be careful about regulating any choices of parents, because all of these regulations ultimately stem from the bureaucrat thinking they know better than the parents themselves. And if you're going to regulate it just based on one metric, a standardized test score, you miss everything else that can contribute to the mental health issues. So I just be careful about any strings you might attach to these programs, but even if strings are attached, it's still better than the status quo where you don't have any choice at all.
And there's one thing that I'll add to build on the question. So, Corey, thank you for adding that ESAs, for example, provide a path to the sort of instruction that you're talking about. There is a change within the legal framework such that religious schools can't be excluded from these sorts of programs, right? That is a big shift at the level of the United States Supreme Court, that to exclude these sorts of schools is discrimination.
And we have another case that we're going to win pretty, right? The last one was Espinoza v. Montana. We won that 5-4. People are theorizing 6-3 with Carson v. Macon. And the Espinoza decision indicated, John Roberts said, what was the quote? "A state need not subsidize private education, but once it decides to do so, it cannot exclude a school solely because it is religious." So if you're gonna have school choice, you have to include all types of schools. And there's actually an argument to be made, and has been made in the Wall Street Journal by a law professor a couple months ago, you might wanna look it up, that absent school choice, a compulsory government-run one-size-fits-all school system that you're compelled to attend through compulsory education laws and discriminates against religious people. That's a 14th Amendment argument against a system that does not allow you to choose to take your kids' education dollars to a private religious school. And there's another argument that can be made based on free exercise clause of, to freely exercise your religion. And there was also, believe they made an argument in that article about this being compelled speech by the government. So there is an argument that the current system is unconstitutional unless you have school choice. Look it up. It's in the Wall Street Journal.
And we have a question in the back.
Thank you. Yep, Bob Hall, one of your state senators. Thank you guys. Michael, Corey, Kurtis, good comments there. Michael, your comment in particular about education is not just about economic prosperity. When you reflect back to our founding fathers, passed one of the most important bills, and I mentioned this in another place earlier, so you were sitting there, when they passed the Northwest Ordinance, which required children to be educated. But they required to be educated using the Bible, but we've gotten away from that. But they knew that freedom, the protection of liberty necessitated an educated public that could discern, that had critical thinking. And so what you're talking about doing is what we have to do to move back to educating our children so that they are fully educated, not just trained to make a dollar once they graduate in there. And I know what we're faced with. You can't count on your legislatures to do this job by themselves. We found that out 2 sessions ago when the schools came after the legislature, particularly in the rural areas, and put the fear of God in them. And so we could not get school choice. It was a #1 item. It was some of the leaders, some of us in the legislature, that was our big item, could get nowhere with it because of the school. They got active. Well, the message there is things have changed since then. That what has come out with the statements are made, like what happened in Virginia and other places, to let people understand that more people are gonna have to get activated. And parents, we don't have enough of them that understand that they have a choice. They should have a choice, that they have rights. That's reflected in what we're having to do in the school otherwise. What I'm trying to get around to say is, how are we going to get the word out to get more people active in pushing this issue so that the legislators have support coming from the districts so the legislation can be passed? We can do that, but you have too many of them who, like some of our leaders right now, wet their finger and stick up in the air and say, which way's the wind blowing? Oh, that's the way I'm gonna vote. To overcome that, if you get enough, the wind blowing to support this, back like we had in the early days of the Tea Party when it was very effective because it had lots of voices screaming and hollering about making the change. So how are we gonna do that to get people activated?
the new special interest group, parents. The same parents that are
But we
fighting
need
at the
to be-
school board meetings need to come to the Capitol and fight for school choice as the ultimate solution to the disconnect between the values in the government school and their family. So I think that's the best solution. We have to, how do you mobilize them? Set up email campaigns. You can reach out to parent groups that are in the area, but it's going to take people on the ground to mobilize those parents.
You understand? That's why I asked the question, because it's not just coming to events like this and going home and talking to each other in the echo chamber. You got to go talk to people who don't even understand what you're talking about and tell them you're going to lose our country if we don't get our schools changed where we start educating our kids.
And I agree. I think now more than ever, we have this groundswell of support of people upset for a lot of different reasons about a disconnect either with their values or school closures or whatever it is. And they're pushing back at the school board meetings, which I think is a step in the right direction. You should participate in the democratic process, right? But I think the ultimate solution is having the money follow the child, because that's an immediate solution. And let's say you get the right people in office at the school board. How long is it going to take? And what if the teachers in the classroom don't actually teach? And what if you implement something that says they can't teach this or that, and they just start calling it something else? Families shouldn't be trapped in these schools any longer. They should get a chance right away. And I think just capitalizing on the frustrations of the parents, or at least understanding their frustrations and channeling that momentum towards educational freedom in all forms, I think is the way that we do that. How? On the ground? That's going to take groups in Texas to figure that out, and hopefully some people in the room have some ideas about how to mobilize parents, but I think that's ultimately what we have to do. The parents are there, the energy's there, we just need to direct it towards the right solution.
Completely agree, Corey. It'll take all of us working together in that direction to mobilize the grassroots and get them to voice support within the legislature. We have time for one last question. There's a lady in the back that has had her hand up for a little while.
I used to substitute teach years ago, and one of the things that really irritated me was that the money did not go for teachers. It did not go for kids. It just went for the administrators that had a big fat check. You know, in Odessa, Texas, where I live, the superintendent gets paid $250,000 a year. For what? You know? I would like to know what is the incentive when we're going into doing homeschooling or doing something that's a charter school to draw some of the good teachers to go to that kind of format with charter school. Because I know in teaching for the public school system, you have a retirement fund your money goes into whether you like it or not. You know, it's not Social Security, it's for teachers' retirement fund. I would love for that to be able to take that and go where I wanted to teach, not have it have to be through the public school system. So what's some of the incentives that we have to get some good educators out there?
So I'll go ahead and provide a little bit of framing and then turn it over to Kurtis. Within the state of Texas, we spend $14,000 per year per child. Right? So
Probably
if you
more
look-
now with all the bailout money from the federal government.
Yeah, that's before
They're
the 12
spending it
billion.
on stadiums. It's COVID relief, though. It's COVID relief.
So, but then you look at teacher salaries and you look at what, it costs for, or what we're spending on a full classroom, that's $250,000 to $300,000 per classroom, right? It is different for charters because you all don't get the funding for buildings or anything like that. But when I look at those numbers, I'm a numbers guy. I like spreadsheets and to see, what people's priorities really are when the rubber hits the road. Teachers should be making more money. Teachers should be treated as professionals in a way that they aren't right now. And it frustrates me to no end when I see them being constantly pushed and restricted in ways that prevent them from their core function of teaching and learning. That's why they got into the profession in the first place. But charter schools since 1995 have provided an alternate for those teachers, right? Not just for families, but for those teachers as well. So I would open it up to you, Kurtis. How do you recruit and attract and retain teachers? What do you hear from them that they appreciate about your all's model?
Yeah, that's a great question. Major dynamic at play right now is talent. the Great Resignation and trying to find teachers and employees for different jobs. And so at a charter school, at Great Hearts, there's real opportunity for a values alignment. I mean, we talk about and teach virtue. We talk about and teach the classics. So for a lot of families, a lot of our teachers send their kids to our schools. They start volunteering, and then they become a teacher because they love it so much, and it creates work-life alignment and integration. So there's value and purpose alignment that can be achieved. There's also flexibility. With online, there's flexibility, with when you teach and where you teach, and cutting a 90-minute commute if that's important to you, and how that plays out each day. And so it's really important to listen to your best teachers and think about what is the value proposition for them? How do I find the right fit for them to make this the best place to work? Another thing that we do is that we have 2 teachers in our elementary classrooms, right? So there's a teacher, and there's a teacher's assistant, and it's a pipeline, and it's a way of serving communities, but having multiple people in it. And so again, for many teachers, oh, that's wonderful, I'm not all alone, we're doing this together, we're team teaching, we're integrating into these different pieces. And so thinking about the values alignment, about the flexibility that happens in online, and then with micro schools, these are educational entrepreneurs. You have some of your best teachers. Every teacher at some point, or maybe every day, thinks, I should build a school, right? I could do this better. And in micro schools, that's exactly what we're doing. We're tapping the best teachers who want to build their own school in partnership with us and saying, great, go do it. We're micro philanthropists to support you in your journey, and go out and build the school that you want to see.
Awesome. Thank you, Kurtis, and thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.